I'm going to give you a piece of music so you can actually see what the music looks like. So I'm going to have the Graham family singers come up here. Traditionally, the way they would do this is when they would get a piece of music, they would actually sing what they call sing the shapes first. They would go through and sing the do, re, mi's to the shapes to get their 4 parts, and then they would sing the verses. And it was tradition back then to sing all the verses. So you would do it once with the shapes, and in the case of this one, there's 4 verses, so you would do it once with the shapes and then all 4 verses in the chorus, and you do the whole song. Now, when they do this, they're going to do it the way they normally do it when they're performing this. And what they do is they'll sing 1 verse in a chorus, and then they'll do the syllables or the shapes for you. Listen for the do, re, mi's. And each one of these shapes has a different do, re, mi to it. And I don't know what those are anymore. They could tell you. So I'm going to let them do that right now.
There is a blessed anthem God put in me to stay. This world knows nothing like it, its sweeter grows each day. It rises over mountains, it's deeper than the sea. This holy, happy chorus, salvation put in me. I don't know what to call it, please, it's beyond control. This chorus has me ringing in my soul. No language ever spoken out, my dread portray. Hallelujah, hallelujah, heaven's here to stay. And when this human organ can sing no more below, 'twill sound a sweeter anthem above me where I go, to sing with all the angels and Jesus whom I love. This hallelujah chorus forevermore above. I don't know what to call it, this beyond control. This chorus is ringing in my soul. No language ever spoken out, my dread portray. Hallelujah, hallelujah, heaven's here to stay.
Wow, that's awesome, guys. That's great.
Now, 100 years ago, that's what was going on in the churches all over the country. That was just 10 or 12 songs like that every morning, and you're ready to go. Well, I want you to hear that. It's one thing to talk about it, but if you can actually hear, it makes a lot more sense. Today, I want to talk about, we're going to be kind of switching into learning now. Now that we got this very bright child, how do we go about feeding information into them, and what's the best way to do that? I'm going to start out working with children, learning to do some things, but in the next week or two, I'm going to be transitioning into actual learning theory and all this, which is going to be very valuable for your kids, but it's going to be very valuable for you because you can apply it. You can actually do it. Okay, let's talk about reading first. Here you have this child. You know, children are ready for reading at different ages. Some are ready at 2 years old, some 3, 4, 5, 6, some aren't ready until 9 or 10. But when that child is ready to learn to read, how do you approach that? Number 1 rule is don't teach them this little song. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Teach them that. That'll set them back about a year or two. Don't do that. ABCs are writing skills. You're not ready to teach the child to write until they can read. You got to teach them to read first, then we teach them to write. And so until they're ready to write, they don't need to know the names of the letters. In fact, knowing the names of the letters will only get in the way and impede the reading process. What do you want to teach them? What you want to teach them is you have them look at letters and you teach them the letter sounds. Taking this word, for instance, you would not teach them that that's a C, an A, and a T. You teach the beginning reader that's a K, A, T. That's what you teach them. Now, why is that important? Because if they learn the letters, C-A-T, and then you say, let's start reading, and what's that word? And they're going to go, C-A-T, which of course has nothing to do with cat. So if they know the sounds instead, and they know it's K, A, and T, and now you say, let's put those together, and what's that word? And of course the child's going to say what? K, A, T. Great. Now, can you do it a little faster? Cat. Good. Can you do it a little faster, as fast as you can? Cat. Good. You got it. Cat. That's the word. If they know the letter sounds, they're already readers. They just have to learn how to put the sounds together and say them very fast. Okay? If they can do that, they can read. So basically, once you've taught them the 26 letters, you already have a reader. Well, not really. You have someone who can say the words. We're going to talk a little bit about reading in a minute. One of the things that I like, I'm big on phonics. Now, when I went and got my degree, the war was on. You had those teachers who said, phonics, you want to go phonics. Phonics is the way to go. Whole language, bad, 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 don't want to do that. It's phonics. If you ever heard Phyllis Schlafly, she's the pro-phonics person in the Christian world that hasn't quite figured out what reality is yet. But she's big on phonics. No whole language, all phonics. Teach your kid phonics and you've solved the problem. Then you had the other group of people that were whole language, phonics, bad. Phonics just doesn't work. You need whole language. Now, whole language involves just about everything that isn't phonics. It's looking at the text and guessing at the word. It's using contextual clues. It's looking at the picture and figuring out what the words are based on the picture. I mean, you name it. If it's not phonics, it's whole language, basically. So you had those teachers who taught whole language. Well, I was kind of the odd guy out because I was saying you need to teach both. When I went back a few years ago to get recertified, I took a reading class. And guess what they're teaching now? They have finally figured it out. You need both. You need phonics and whole language. And basically my approach has always been this. You teach your child phonics, you teach them whole language, and if you can think of something else that's not included in there already, teach them that too, because everything you can give your child to help them decipher the text is great. But that's all these things are. They're simply tools for deciphering the text, figuring out what the word is and how to say it. It doesn't teach you to read. Example I give is one day we were over at a friend of ours, and he had some children who were having a hard time in school, and so he bought them hooked on phonics, and he wanted to know what I thought about it. And I says, well, I don't know. I've heard it's good. We bought the phonics game for our kids, and it was really well, and I've heard hooked on phonics is just about as good as that. I don't think it makes much difference. It's a good thing to do. However, I said to this gentleman, and he was a Mexican fellow, and I said, do you have any books around here written in Spanish? Yeah. Do you know Spanish? Yes. So go get me a book. So he went and got a book, and I read the first paragraph to him, and I said, now, did you understand what I read? And he said, oh, absolutely. I said, that's very good, because I didn't. See, I knew phonics. See, I know in Spanish that two L's are not pronounced ol, they're pronounced ya. We already talked about that, right? I know that, so I can read Spanish. Now, I don't have all the accent and everything just exactly right, but I can read a Spanish text well enough that a person who knows Spanish will understand what I'm talking about, and they're going to go, oh, he's reading Spanish. No, I'm not, because reading is the process of bringing meaning to the text. So if you don't understand those words you're saying, you're not reading. Reading, you have to bring meaning to it. Do we need phonics? Does phonics help us decipher those words? Does whole language help us do that? Yes. And so you can do games, flashcards, you can use everyday life. We used to, when our kids were learning to read, we'd pull into the parking lot of a store and say, hey, what's that say? What's that letter? Everywhere there's words. That helps too, because why am I learning to read? If you're having them read the signs as best they can, it shows that this skill opens up the world to me. That's why I want to know this, because I want to be able to do what mom and dad do. So there's a reason for going through all this grief at home, learning how to say the letters and all of that. But you have to get to a point of where you're bringing meaning to the text. That is absolutely crucial. The goal of reading instruction is to accomplish those two things, be able to bring meaning to the text and to be able to sight read. Most of you in here are probably sight readers to one degree or another. Now, what's a sight reader? That means you look at that word, and do you use phonics to determine what that word means? Are you using context clues to figure out what that word means? Are you using any of phonics or whole language skills at all to figure out what that word means? No. You look at that word and what? You know what that word is. You're not using any of those things we teach in school. So the goal is to basically get to a point where you don't need phonics. You don't need these whole language skills. You don't need any of that except under one condition, and that is when you come to a word you don't know. Try reading the Old Testament. You come to Shadrach, Meshach, and you're going to need it there, okay? But normally, just reading normal text, we don't use any of those things. We are sight readers. So the goal is to get your child to a point where they're a sight reader and they're able to bring meaning to the text, meaning like they're strong in vocabulary. Because if they don't know what these words mean, they can sit there. And there's a whole lot of parents out there that, and we've run into them, oh, listen to my child read. And they give them the text and they quote unquote read it. Don't ask that child what they just read, and don't ask them to explain what they just read because they don't have a clue. That is not a reader. That is a person who's simply saying words. If they don't know what those words mean, they're not reading. They're not reading. So don't get suckered into the fact that just because your child can pronounce the words, that you have a reader on your hands. Check the meaning. If it's not there, you got some work to do. Now, once we have a reader, now your child's reading. Now we're ready to do writing. Now's when you teach them a little song. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Because now you're going to teach them, you know all those letters that you've been using to read? Guess what? They have another name. This is called C. This is called A. This is called T. Because if you ask somebody, how do you spell cat, you don't want them coming back and saying cat. You spell cat, C-A-T. So in order to spell, you have to know the other name. But now you already have a reader, so you're not going to confuse this child with, is it a C or a K? Is it an A or an A? Is it a T or a T? They're not going to get confused on that. But they know how to read. Now we teach them how to spell, and that's using the letter names. Now once they know the letter names, now you can start teaching them to spell the words. And once they can start to spell words, guess what? Now they're able to put those words into sentences. That's the next step, and now you have a writer. You see the sequence there. The mistake we make with our kids a lot of times is we start teaching them how to write before we teach them how to read. And then we get them confused. You know, when you're just 3 or 4 years old, having to try to remember 2 names for these letters is very confusing. It's very confusing. So don't introduce the writing part until they're ready to do that. And that means they're already reading. Now, that doesn't mean they can pick up the KJV version of the Bible and read it fluently. That's not what I'm talking about. When I say you have a reader, I'm talking about somebody that can read at the level of see Jane run, see Dick run, like a lot of us grew up on. I'm talking about reading like at a first grade level. Then you're ready to start teaching them to write. You don't have to wait until they can read everything. But when you start teaching them to write, what do you want to teach them to write? Also at the level that they're reading on. And then their writing can progress with the reading. As we start dealing with reading, we run into reading problems and basically what we call learning disabilities. Let me go through what you're likely to run into. And a lot of children have a lot of these problems. Very few kids start doing this process without any issues at all. Almost every child has an issue here or there. It's just the way we're wired. We're just not perfect. So as we go through this, as you look back to your own children, even if they're growing, you're going to go, oh, yeah, that fits. I wish I'd known that then. But anyway, first thing you need to know is when you're dealing with learning disabilities, and this applies to those parents who have their children in public school or a Christian school or any school other than homeschool. Homeschool is a totally different area. But anytime you're dealing with schools, either public or private, you need to understand something. When you come to a reading disability or a math disability or any disability, school specialists and teachers are very limited in what they can do just because of the nature of the beast. I'm going to give you a real quick story that happened to me. When I began my student teaching, I began it in August at the beginning of the school year, which was really neat. Because I was able to go in and sit down with the teacher the week prior to classes starting, and she pulled out all the documents on the children that I needed to know about. And 3 of them in particular, there were 3 of them. There was John and Brenda and Amy. I'll never forget these 3, because they were the low reading group. They just weren't there. They were in 4th grade, but barely reading at a 1st grade level, failing everything. So we went through and I got all the scoop on them, and so during the first week and a half of a student teacher's life, the student teacher spends their life in a chair in a corner observing. That was my job, simply to observe for about the first week and a half. And then slowly over the next week, the teacher would transition that class to me, and then it was mine for the next 8 weeks. So as I'm sitting there observing, I'm really focusing on my 3 problem children because I knew that when that class transitioned to me, this was going to be the group of kids that was going to be the challenge for me. So I wanted to be really solid on them. So I began to watch them, and you know, they all fit the scenario, but I began to notice something. Amy didn't seem to, I got a sense she shouldn't be in that group. Something wasn't right. Now, John and Brenda definitely belonged in that situation, but I didn't feel comfortable with Amy, and I began to really watch her really close, began to really zero in on her. So when the class transitioned to me, I began to do some things in the class. You've all seen those tables. They're about as big as this, but they're kind of semicircle, and they got the cut in here where the teacher can sit. I'd bring those 3 and put them around, and for the tests, I would read every test for them. And the other kids would say, that's not fair. You're reading the test to them, but you're not reading to us. And I'd say, do any of you hear my voice? I don't have a soft voice. Listen in. You want the test read to you? Listen. I'm reading loud enough for everybody in the room to hear. But I'd read the test. Every test got read. And it was very interesting. John and Brenda, guess what their scores were? Not real good. Oh, Amy was just like, no problem. She was getting it. I'm going, wow, what is this? You understand if you have a child who cannot read, that they never take a science test, they never take a math test, they never take a social studies test. Every test they take is a reading test. So it doesn't matter what subject area you're taking the test in, your grade is in reading. And your grade in reading is always very what? Poor. Of course, they don't learn the material because they can't read. So this was the situation for these 3. Well, a few weeks into class, what they were going to do, Amy was the lowest one in the class, and they were going to staff her out. Now, basically what that means in English is we're going to take her, put her in special ed, and forget she exists. And we're going to babysit her. And, of course, we'll keep passing her along, and at 12th grade she'll graduate, but she won't be able to read, she won't be able to do math, she won't be able to do anything, she won't be able to function in society, but we really don't care because we aren't going to deal with her. Now, that's the reality of it. Now, it's not so much that way today, but back in those days, it was. So she's going to be staffed out. My teacher says to me, my cooperating teacher says, I want you to come sit in just in case anybody has any questions because you've been the one working with her. So you know her better than I do. So in case anybody has any questions, I want you to come in. They had all the teachers and the school psychologists and everybody, and they went around and every one of them put their 2 cents worth in, which was basically, yeah, in my opinion, she needs to be staffed. They pretty much decided what to do, and fortunately, the head guy looks at me and he says, Ken, since you've been working with her, what do you want to say? And I figured, well, let's go for broke here. I said, well, you're all wrong. She doesn't need to be staffed. It's the biggest mistake that you'll ever make in this girl's life if you do that. And of course, he then asked the very question I was hoping he'd ask. Well, do you have any proof of that? What are you basing that on? So for the next 20 minutes, I showed them all the statistics that I've been keeping on Amy and what I've been doing with her. The long and the short of it is they decided to leave her in that class until my student teaching was over about 6 weeks later. And so I began to work with her, and my cooperating teacher got very interested in what I was doing. And so at the end of the time, they had another meeting and asked the cooperating teacher, well, what do you want to do? And she says, well, I think what we're doing is working. Let's keep her in the class. And so they kept her in the class. And Edie and I went over we got to be good friends with her mom, and we were over there after school ended that year. And her mother said, Amy, go get your report card. And you know what? Her report card was so good that if she just got 1 letter grade higher on just one of them, she'd have made the honor roll. Amy never was staffed out. She went through school a normal person. By the time she graduated, I don't think any of her fellow students ever realized that she was ever that close to being just forgotten as a special ed kid. So what made the difference? What was it that happened there that had I been the regular classroom teacher, I would have missed Amy. I would have staffed her if that had been my class. What do you think made the difference? I had 10 days to sit there and do nothing but observe 6 hours a day. You realize an average classroom teacher cannot do that. The school reading specialist cannot do that. So when I say they are very limited in what they can do, I'm not condemning them. I'm just saying that's the reality of it. The school district can't hire 30 adults to sit in a classroom and each one of them focus on one of those 30 kids. Well, they could, but our property taxes would be about 10 times what they are. So the system can't do that. Who's it up to? It's up to the parents. This is why I say every parent is a homeschooler. Every parent is a homeschooler. Now, you may send your child to public school so that they can assist you in that job, but the job of schooling your child is yours, not the school district. It's your job. It's your job to see to it that your child can read. It's not the teacher's job. The teacher's going to do the best job they can. And if you have a normal child, they'll be able to pull that off. But if you have a child with a reading disability, the school district probably isn't going to be able to do that. That's going to fall to you. You're going to have to do that. So you're going to want to enlist relatives and friends and everything else. You're going to want to find someone who knows a little bit about what's going on, someone like myself who can give you some advice and how do you deal with this. So you're going to need some help. You're going to need training, some direction, some ideas and things to do. But ultimately, you're going to have to do the work. You're going to have to teach your child to read or do math or whatever. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about what are some possible causes of a learning disability, specifically reading. One of the things is you may have a genuinely limited intelligence. You just may have a kid with an IQ of 60, 70, 80, and that just may be reality. That's not where I'm going to talk about right now. And that's not usually the case, so I'm not going to really get into that. You can have brain dysfunction through uncoordinated left and right hemispheres, and that's why we talked about the left and right hemisphere. Those two have to work together. Even if you're a left brain person, you can't operate without that right brain. You understand? It has to be operated at some fairly high degree. It may not be as high as the left, so you may be a predominantly left brain person, but you know, you cut that right brain out and you're dead, okay? I mean, not dead literally, but I mean, you can't function. And a right brain person can't function without the left brain. You need those two halves of the brains communicating with each other. And sometimes what happens is the connections between the two halves aren't quite what they should be, and those two halves of the brain aren't communicating the way they're supposed to. And that can cause problems in reading because reading involves both sides of the brain. And if they're not communicating, you have a difficulty there. So you can have a brain dysfunction there. Believe it or not, an imbalance in the inner ears, problems in the inner ear can cause problems with reading. Poor eyesight or hearing. Going back to Amy, I was trying to work with her. I was actually working at Metropolitan State College in the reading lab there. So I would take her after school and we'd get in the car and we'd go to Metro and she'd go with me and I'd work with her on some of the equipment they had there, and I'm trying to zero in on what her problem is and not getting very far. And one day on the way to Metro, I think we were going down Federal, and I saw this really cute billboard or something, and I said, "Amy, look at that." She couldn't see it. And I began to experiment on the way to school, and I discovered that whenever I'd see a billboard and I could read it, we had to be 3 times closer until she could read it. Well, that's interesting. So we got to school, and there were signs on the wall and stuff, and I would get at the back of the classroom and walk until I could read it, and then guess what? She had to be 1/3 that distance before she could see it. So I went to the school, because I'm still student teaching there, and I went into the school nurse and I said, "You need to test Amy's eyesight. The girl is blind." She said, "Well, we tested her at the beginning of the school year, like 3 weeks ago." She was 20/20. So we're not going to take time to do it. I could not get them to redo it. So we went to her mother and I said, "Get this girl to the eye doctor, get her eyes checked. I don't care what the school says. She's blind. She can't see." So guess what? She took her to the eye doctor, and the eye doctor said, "What do you think?" "She's blind. She needs some of these. The girl can't see." So they got her glasses. And then she began to be able to read. Why couldn't she read? She couldn't see the letters. She couldn't see it. You say, well, how did she get 20/20 on the test? We're talking about a young lady here, firstborn, only child. What do you think her IQ was? She wasn't stupid. Wasn't high, but it was over 100. She was a very smart child. Very smart child. She was smart enough to know that they always called the kids down to read the little chart on the wall in groups of 3. She was smart enough to make sure she was the 3rd one in line, and it only took 2 people in front of her for her to memorize that chart. And so when they said to her, "Read the 3rd line," she just recited it to them, and of course got it right. She had 20/20 vision as far as they were concerned. She didn't know that her being real smart was actually her undoing. She was smart enough to make sure that she had to come up with a strategy to deal with this problem she had. She didn't want to look stupid, so she figured it out. Poor eyesight, probably one of the biggest problems there is when it comes to reading. So you have a child that's not reading well, first thing you want to do is get their eyesight and their hearing checked. First thing, before you do anything else, just do that. It's good to know anyway. Here's a good one, psychological immaturity. I've just recently had a chance to work with a child where this absolutely, I am convinced, was the case. We call this readiness. Remember I said some kids are ready to read at age 2 and 3? Others aren't ready to read until they're 9 or 10. Doesn't have anything to do with IQ. We have children with IQs of 130 who aren't ready to read until they're 9 or 10 years old. Has nothing to do with intelligence. It's just the maturation of the brain. You all understand that a baby that's 3 weeks old is not ready to learn to read. You can get the books out if you want and try and teach them to read, but you're barking up the wrong tree. They're just not going to be able to do it, are they? You have to reach a point where the brain is matured enough to where it's able to comprehend that information and be able to process it. And that happens at different ages regardless of IQ. The problem a lot of parents think is if my kid's 7, 8 years old and they're not reading yet, it means they're dumb. It means I got a low IQ child here. No, you can have an Einstein on your hands. And they're just not doing it. So readiness is very important. And when you talk about readiness, you got to understand you got to do everything's in sequence, prerequisite. You ever heard Isaiah 28:10? For precept must be upon precept, precept upon precept, line upon line upon line, here a little and there a little. That's the way it's got to be done. And so you got to get that first precept. Are they ready? Are they ready for that? One of the things that can cause a problem is you can have increased blood flow to one part of the brain. Say one part of the brain, and I'm not talking left or right, I'm talking about a specific part of the brain is getting all the blood and the rest of the brain isn't. And this is what produces these kinds of kids. Savants, prodigies, geniuses, gifted. And what is the interesting thing on a lot of these is these kind of children and savants are the most extreme case of this. How many of you know what a savant is? Let me explain a savant. A savant is a child who can be 15 years old and still can't function any better than like a 1-year-old. They can't talk, they can't read, they can't do anything. And then one day, mom puts on a record of Beethoven, and about 5 minutes later, this child gets up, goes over to the piano, and begins to play beautiful, perfect Beethoven. What causes that? My kids play beautiful piano, but they'd love to be able to have that ability. They have to work at learning to play Beethoven. The savant can hear it, and for the first time after he's just heard it, get up and go to the piano and play it perfectly, as if he's been practicing for 15 years. They can get up and draw pictures. They can get up and do something in a particular area, but they are totally non-functional in the other area. That's your savant. Prodigies are the next step down. Again, they are very, very bright in a given area, not so bright in other areas. The difference is prodigies are very functional in society. They look like everybody else. They can communicate with you. They can deal with you. It's just that they're just not real good at math. Or maybe they just can't learn math. Perfect example of the child prodigy is Einstein. So you have these kind of people. Then geniuses, they're a little more balanced. They're just very, very bright in some areas. Not as smart as a prodigy, but they're very bright. But they're not exactly inhibited in other areas either. They can do math. They're just not math geniuses, but they can handle it. You run into a lot of people who operate in the genius and gifted area. In fact, it's my contention that almost every child out there is gifted in something. You just need to find it. And we talked a little bit about that, right? I don't know too many children unless they fall into one of those others, unless they're the savant or prodigy type child or brain damaged or something like that. I just don't know of any child that's not gifted in something. God gave them all something that they can do well. But in the case of the savant and the prodigies and geniuses, the cause of a deficiency in one area is the very thing that's causing the increase in the other. In other words, you take these people, they might be geniuses in math, but they can't read. Why? Because all the blood flow is going to the math area of the brain, and the reading area of the brain isn't getting anything. So the very thing that makes them so smart in one area is the very thing that's killing them in another area. And it's physical. It's physical. There's not anything you can do about it. It's the way God made them. Now, we're coming up with ways to go in and do surgery and things and affect that, but not a whole lot's being done at this point. So if that's what's going on, work on the strengths, work on the weaknesses, but don't get too hung up on the fact that they can't do that. So God can use everybody, and you got to figure out what's going on. And if you have one of those prodigies or geniuses, then I wouldn't spend a lot of time on those deficient areas because our brain's just not wired to do it, and it's not going to be wired to do it. Another reason that some people can't read is they're blind. I'll read this to you. You tell me if you know who this is. This guy is an American composer, singer, and musician, a child prodigy. He recorded his first hit in 1963 at the age of 13. He since has matured into one of the most highly praised artists in popular music. He uses his music as a force for social progress. That's a little bio on this guy. Anybody know who he is? Stevie Wonder. Blind. So what's the point here? Maybe you got a child that just is not going to be able to read. Well, so what? Reading's nice, but it's not absolutely necessary. It's one of those things you want to train your child in doing very well if they have the ability, but if they don't have the ability, don't let it shake you up too much. Another reason for children not being able to read or having reading disabilities is inappropriate teaching methods. We run into that a lot. Another thing that can be a cause here is an unstable home environment. It can cause a lot of reading problems. We have a lot of this today. You have different kinds of homes. You have a home that's inwardly unstable and outwardly unstable. You have another kind of home that's outwardly stable but inwardly unstable. We have situations you've heard Pastor Mark talk about, being adopted, having to deal with rejection issues. My children, some of my kids are dealing with this rejection stuff. So it's another case where they're outwardly very stable, but behind closed doors, we deal with rejection issues because it is there. And those kinds of things can get in the way and cause learning disabilities. We'll finish with this next week, but I want to start with a very common form and very misunderstood form of reading disability. This is probably the most misunderstood type of disability there is. It's called dyslexia. Let me give you the definition of dyslexia. A variable, often familial, that means it's in the genes, learning disability involving difficulties in acquiring and processing language that is typically manifested by a lack of proficiency in reading, spelling, and writing. Familial means tending to occur in more members of a family than expected by chance alone. Runs in the family. Let me run through real quick some of the symptoms. One of the most obvious and common telltale signs is reversals. People with this kind of problem often confuse letters like B and D, either when reading or when writing. They sometimes read or write words like rat for tar or one for now. Another sure sign which needs no confirmation by means of any form of testing is lesions. That's when a person sometimes reads or writes cat when the word is actually cart. A person who reads very slowly, hesitantly, who reads without fluency, word by word, or constantly loses their place, thereby leaving out whole chunks of reading in the same passage. And these are all called dyslexia, by the way. The person may try to sound out the letters of the word, but then be unable to say the correct word. For example, he may sound the letters C-A-T, ka-a-ta, and then say cold. He may read or write letters of a word in wrong order, like left for felt, or syllables in the wrong order, like emony for enemy. Or words in the wrong order, like are there, they'll read there are. He may spell words as they sound, for example, R-I-T-E instead of R-I-G-H-T. He may read with poor comprehension, or it may be that he remembers little of what he reads. The person may have a poor and or slow handwriting. Now those are all symptoms that all are diagnosed as dyslexia. So in short, what is dyslexia? Basically, we have all sorts of reading problems that we can identify. This child has this problem, this child has this problem, this child has this problem. But we have a whole bunch of reading problems, learning disabilities and reading problems, but we don't know what they are, we don't know what causes them, we don't know anything about them. We can't get a handle on it. And they are as different as night and day. And you know what we call them? Dyslexia. Dyslexia simply means this child has a reading problem. We don't know what it is, we don't know what causes it, we don't know how to fix it. That's what dyslexia is. It can be any of those things that I just read and more. But if we haven't put a name on it, this is this type of disability, this is what it is, this is what causes it, and this is how we can fix it. If we haven't done that, then it's dyslexia. Well, my child's dyslexic. I go, whoopee-dee, what does that mean? It means the people you're taking him to are clueless. That's what that means. That's all dyslexia means. So you don't read any more into it than that. But why do people have it? Here's some things. Is it caused by the way they're born, or is it environment? We're going to get into this next week, but it's probably environment. Why? Because we have more boys than girls have it. And it's more prevalent in the inner cities than in rural areas, which are things that environment can affect. The point here is can dyslexia be fixed? And I'm going to leave you with this. If we move from a rural to an inner city environment and now we create the problem, here's the simple solution to that. If we can create the problem, we can fix the problem. So the trick is now understanding, okay, how do we go about doing that?